My husband's entire family boarded a first-class flight to Paris, leaving me alone in the intensive care unit to unplug his life support. They thought they had secured his $2 billion empire. They thought the girl from the south side would just cry and sign the papers. But the exact second their plane left the runway, my comatose husband's freezing hand clamped down on my wrist. He sat up gasping for air and whispered, "We have to leave right now or they are going to kill us both." "Sign the paper, Jasmine." The sharp, demanding voice of my mother-in-law. Cecilia sliced through the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. She did not walk into the intensive care unit so much as she invaded it, bringing with her the overpowering scent of expensive perfume and an air of absolute disdain. She stood at the foot of my husband's hospital bed wearing a tailored designer suit, completely inappropriate for a trauma ward, but perfectly suited for the first-class lounge at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. With a flick of her manicured wrist, she tossed a thick manila folder directly onto my lap. It landed with a heavy thud against my thighs. I looked down. On top of the stack was a "Do Not Resuscitate" order. Beneath it were medical bills totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. "This family is not going to throw money at a corpse," she said, her voice cold and devoid of any maternal affection for the son lying unconscious between us. "Julian is brain dead. The doctors have made it clear. We are not going to sit around in a depressing hospital while our lives stop. Our flight to Paris for Fashion Week leaves this evening. You need to sign that release, take care of this empty shell, and figure out how to pay these bills yourself, you parasite." I kept my eyes on this paperwork, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing my hands shake. I had spent 3 days sitting in this sterile room, watching a machine breathe for the man I loved, while his family treated his tragic accident like an inconvenient scheduling conflict. Before I could formulate a response, Victoria stepped out from behind Cecilia. Victoria was married to Julian's younger brother Elias. She came from a wealthy white political family in Georgia, and she had built her entire personality around using her privilege to make me feel small. She crossed her arms, adjusting the heavy diamond ring on her finger. "I told the family, Julian should have married someone with a better pedigree," Victoria said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy that barely concealed her amusement. "A real estate empire like his needed a wife who understood legacy, not some hood girl from the south side of Atlanta who got lucky. You never belonged in our world, Jasmine. Now that Julian is gone, your free ride is over. Figure out the medical debt yourself. I hear bankruptcy is very common where you come from." Elias stepped into the room right behind his wife, checking his gold watch impatiently. "Come on, we need to get to the international terminal. Let the street rat handle the garbage disposal. We have a $2 billion transition plan to announce in Europe." They stood there looking down at me, a united front of arrogance and greed. For years, they had looked at me as the enemy. Julian and I had built a beautiful life together, despite their constant interference. I was not some helpless charity case. I was the founder and chief executive officer of the top independent financial forensics and cybersecurity firm in the state. I dug into hidden money for a living. I tracked digital footprints that billionaires tried to erase. But to them, I would always just be the girl from the wrong zip code. I did not cry. Crying was for people who had no leverage. I slowly stood up from the plastic hospital chair. I picked up the "Do Not Resuscitate" form, holding it up so the harsh fluorescent light illuminated the thick black ink where they expected me to sign away my husband's life. Then, with deliberate slowness, I ripped the thick paper in half. Cecilia's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. "What do you think you are doing, you insolent little girl?" I dropped the torn pieces onto the floor and stepped on them. "I am reminding you of who you are actually talking to," I said, keeping my voice deadly quiet. "You call me a parasite, Cecilia. You tell me to figure out how to pay these bills. That is rich coming from a woman who called me crying 2 months ago because she owed $500,000 to an underground gambling syndicate." Cecilia's face lost all its color. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. "Yes," I continued, stepping closer to her. "Did you think Julian did not tell me? Did you think I was not the one who personally bypassed the banking alerts and wired $500,000 of my own hard-earned money to clear your debts so the media would not find out the matriarch of Atlanta's black elite was a gambling addict? You do not have a dime to your name, Cecilia. You survive entirely on the allowance Julian gives you." I turned my gaze to Victoria, who suddenly looked very rigid. "And you, Victoria," I said, letting a slow smile spread across my face. "Talking about pedigree and legacy, your father is running for re-election on a platform of financial integrity. What do you think his voters would say if I leaked the digital audit I ran last week? The audit that proves you have been siphoning money from Julian's corporate credit cards to buy your designer bags and secretly fund your father's political rallies." Victoria's blue eyes widened in pure panic. "You are lying," she stammered, taking a step back. "You do not have access to those accounts. I own a forensic accounting firm, Victoria," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I have access to everything. I know about the offshore routing. I know about the shell companies you and Elias set up in Delaware. I have every single receipt. If you ever speak to me about my background again, I will make sure your father's campaign implodes before his plane even lands in Paris." Elias puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his pride. "You are bluffing. Julian is practically dead. Once the board recognizes my authority tomorrow, we will strip you of everything. You will be back in the projects by the end of the month." "Enjoy your flight, Elias," I said, sitting back down in my chair and crossing my legs. "But do not expect a warm welcome when you return. Because while you are sipping champagne over the Atlantic, I am going to initiate a full-scale hostile audit of the family trust. Have a safe trip." Cecilia glared at me, her chest heaving with suppressed rage. She knew I had her cornered. She knew I held the digital keys to her destruction. "This is not over, Jasmine," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Julian is not waking up. The machines are the only thing keeping him warm. When he finally rots, we will see who holds the power." She spun around on her expensive heels and marched out of the intensive care unit. Elias grabbed Victoria's arm and pulled her into the hallway, following his mother without a single backward glance at the brother lying motionless on the hospital bed. The heavy glass door slid shut, cutting off the sound of their retreating footsteps. The room fell completely silent, save for the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator pushing air into Julian's lungs. I exhaled a long, shaky breath, letting my defensive posture drop. The adrenaline that had fueled my confrontation with them slowly drained away, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I looked at Julian. His strong, handsome face was pale and bruised from the supposed car accident that had put him in this state 3 days ago. His head was wrapped in white bandages, and a web of plastic tubes connected him to the monitors. The doctors said his vehicle had swerved off a mountain road. They said the impact had caused irreversible brain trauma. They told me to prepare for the end. But looking at him, I could not shake the agonizing feeling that something was deeply wrong. Julian was an expert driver. He knew that road perfectly. The local police had rushed the investigation, citing poor weather conditions, but my instincts screamed that the crash was no accident. The timing was too perfect. Julian had been scheduled to present a massive restructuring plan to his investment fund board today, a plan that would have permanently removed Elias and Cecilia from accessing the company accounts. I reached out and gently rested my hand over his. His skin was terrifyingly cold. "I am not letting them win." "Julian," I whispered to the empty room, "I am going to find out exactly what happened on that road. I promise you." I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened a flight tracking application. I had memorized their flight number earlier. I needed to know exactly when they were out of American airspace. I needed to know when I would have the freedom to access Julian's personal laptop without Elias trying to lock me out of the corporate servers. The screen showed the flight status: boarding. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, keeping my eyes glued to the small airplane icon on the map. Minutes dragged by like hours. The harsh lights of the hospital room buzzed overhead. Nurses occasionally walked past the glass wall outside, glancing in with eyes full of pity. I ignored them all. My entire focus was narrowed down to that digital airplane. Status changed to taxing. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I calculated the time zones. By the time they landed in France, I could run a complete decryption on Julian's hard drive. I could find the financial discrepancies he had been investigating before the crash. If his family had orchestrated this tragedy to stop him from exposing their embezzlement, I was going to find the digital footprints. I was going to burn their entire elite world to the ground. The airplane icon moved slowly across the digital map of the airport, approaching the runway. "Come on," I muttered under my breath. "Leave." The status updated to departed. The tiny plane icon lifted off the digital runway, beginning its path toward the Atlantic Ocean. They were gone. I closed the application and slid the phone back into my pocket. I stood up ready to call my lead security engineer to begin the hack. Suddenly, a violent jerk pulled my left arm down. I gasped, stumbling forward as a hand clamped around my wrist like a vice of solid ice. I looked down in absolute shock. Julian's hand. The hand that had been completely limp and lifeless for 3 days was gripping my wrist with terrifying strength. His knuckles were white with the force of it. The heart monitor beside the bed, which had been beeping in a slow, steady rhythm, suddenly shrieked into a rapid, chaotic tempo. Beep, 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 beep. Julian, I breathed, my heart slamming against my ribs. His chest heaved upward, fighting against the ventilator tube. His eyelids fluttered wildly before snapping open. His dark brown eyes, usually so warm and vibrant, were bloodshot and wide with sheer panic. He choked, gagging against the plastic tube in his throat. His free hand flew up, grabbing the tubing and ripping it out of his mouth with a sickening, tearing sound. "Julian, stop," I yelled, reaching for the nurse call button. "You are hurting yourself." He grabbed my other hand, stopping me from pushing the button. He hauled his upper body off the mattress, sitting up completely. The monitors went crazy, flashing red warnings across the screens. His chest expanded as he sucked in a massive, ragged breath of actual room air. He looked at me, his eyes darting frantically toward the door, then back to my face. He was shivering violently, sweat pouring down his forehead despite his freezing skin. "Come with me," he croaked, his voice hoarse and broken from the trauma to his throat. "Julian, you are awake," I sobbed, tears finally breaking through my vision. "I need to get the doctors. You were in a coma." "No," he wheezed, his grip on my wrists tightening until it bruised. "No doctors. Listen to me, Jasmine." He leaned in close, his breath ragged and warm against my cheek. He was not confused. He was not disoriented. He was terrified. "I was not in a coma," he whispered intensely. "I was paralyzed. We have to get out of here right now, or everyone will die." Julian stared into my eyes, his chest heaving with every ragged breath he took. His skin was still ice cold from whatever they had pumped into his veins, but the fierce determination in his grip told me everything I needed to know. He was fighting for his life and mine. I stood frozen by the side of the hospital bed, my mind racing to comprehend the impossible reality unfolding in front of me. Just 10 minutes ago, his family had tossed a stack of medical bills at me and boarded a flight to Paris, acting like he was already in the ground. Now he was sitting up, ripping tubes from his throat and telling me we were going to die. "What do you mean you were paralyzed?" I asked, my voice trembling as I reached out to support his shoulders. "I watched the heart monitor flatline 3 days ago, Julian. The police said your car flipped off the ridge. They said you had irreversible brain trauma." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that turned into a wet cough. He leaned heavily against my arm, clutching his chest as he struggled to speak. "There was no car accident, Jasmine." He wheezed, his voice sounding like broken glass. "It was Elias and Victoria. They poisoned me at the estate during the board preparation dinner." Victoria handed me a glass of scotch, and within minutes I could not breathe. I could not move my legs. I realized what they were doing. They needed me dead before the shareholder meeting, so Elias could step in as proxy and take over the $2 billion fund. I felt all the blood drain from my face. My own brother-in-law and his privileged white wife had tried to murder my husband for money. The sheer audacity of it made my stomach churn. "How are you even alive right now?" I asked, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. "The doctors here told me there was zero brain activity." Julian squeezed my hand, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. When I felt my throat closing up at the estate, I managed to swallow a heavy dose of a beta blocker I keep in my briefcase for my heart palpitations. It slowed my heart rate down so much that I slipped into a deep, medically induced bradycardia. I faked my own coma, Jasmine. I slowed my pulse until I appeared dead just to survive the ambulance ride. I knew if I stayed conscious, they would finish the job before we ever reached the hospital. But I have been awake inside my own body this entire time. I heard everything. I heard them laughing. I heard them tell you to sign the release forms. The horror of his words washed over me. He had been trapped inside a paralyzed body, listening to his mother and brother plot his funeral while packing their bags for a fashion week in France. He had heard Victoria mocking my background, knowing he was completely powerless to defend me. "We have to call the police," I said, reaching for my phone. "I am calling the commissioner right now. We are going to lock them all away." Julian swatted the phone out of my hand. It clattered against the linoleum floor. "No," he gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "You cannot call the police. You cannot call anyone. Victoria comes from a family of politicians. They have the local precinct in their pocket. Who do you think falsified the police report about my car crash? Who do you think paid off the chief of surgery to declare me brain dead?" Before I could process the magnitude of the corruption he was describing, the heavy sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the intensive care unit. Julian's head snapped toward the thick glass door. The panic in his expression was absolute. He tried to push himself off the bed, but his legs gave out and he collapsed against my chest. "They did not leave me here to wake up," he choked out, gripping my shirt. "The doctor on shift tonight, he is on their payroll. They paid him to finish the job once they were safely in the air, so they would have a solid alibi. He is coming, Jasmine." Through the frosted glass panel, I saw the silhouette of a tall man in a white lab coat approaching our room. The handle of the door began to turn. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of the South Side. I had learned early on that when you are cornered, you do not freeze and you do not beg. You fight with everything you have. "Get behind the monitor," I whispered to Julian, shoving him back onto the mattress and pulling the privacy curtain halfway across the bed to obscure his face. The door clicked open. A man with graying hair and cold, indifferent eyes stepped into the room. He wore a pristine white coat and blue surgical gloves. In his right hand, he held a large plastic syringe filled with a clear liquid. I knew enough about medical procedures to recognize the fatal dose of potassium chloride meant to stop a heart instantly. It would look like a natural cardiac arrest, a tragic but expected end for a comatose patient. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me standing at the foot of the bed. He clearly expected the room to be empty. Cecilia must have told him I would be busy crying over the bills in the waiting area. "Mrs. Jasmine," he said, his voice smooth and unsettlingly calm. "I was not expecting you to still be here. Visiting hours are strictly over for this ward. You need to leave immediately so I can administer your husband's final medication." I stared at the syringe in his hand. I did not move. "What medication is that, doctor?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The primary physician told me Julian was not receiving any more intravenous treatments today." The doctor took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Just a standard saline flush to keep the central line clear. Now please step outside or I will have security remove you." He moved toward the bed, raising the syringe. He had no idea Julian was awake and listening. He thought he was about to inject poison into a lifeless body. I took one more step and I reacted. I grabbed the heavy stainless steel medical tray resting on the bedside table. It was loaded with metal clamps, forceps, and glass vials. Using every ounce of upper body strength I possessed, I swung the heavy tray directly at his face. The metal edge caught him squarely across the bridge of his nose with a sickening crunch. The tray shattered against his skull, sending glass vials exploding across the room. The doctor let out a muffled cry of pain, stumbling backward and dropping the lethal syringe. He crashed into the medical cart, sending monitors and wires tumbling to the floor in a chaotic mess. I did not wait for him to recover. I lunged forward, bringing my knee up hard into his stomach. As he doubled over coughing, I grabbed the heavy oxygen tank from the corner and slammed it down against the back of his neck. He crumpled to the floor unconscious before he could even call for help. I stood over him, breathing heavily, my fists clenched. I kicked the syringe under the hospital bed, ensuring it would not be accidentally triggered. I reached down and ripped the security access badge from the doctor's coat pocket. Julian was staring at me from the bed, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. "I told your family I was not someone they could step on," I said, grabbing his arm and pulling him off the bed. "Now let us get you out of this slaughterhouse." Julian was heavy, his muscles still suffering from the lingering effects of the paralytic poison. Poison but adrenaline gave me the strength to hold him upright. I threw his arm over my shoulder, supporting his weight as we staggered toward the door. "We cannot just walk out through the lobby." Julian panted, his bare feet dragging across the floor. "There are security guards at every exit. Victoria probably paid them too. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opening the customized digital terminal I used for my forensics security work. I was not just a business owner. I was a master systems architect. I had built enterprise-level firewalls for multinational banks, and I knew exactly how to dismantle them. "Give me 10 seconds," I said, tapping rapidly on the screen. I scanned the local wireless networks, finding the hospital's primary security server. The encryption was a joke. I bypassed the administrative firewall and accessed the environmental control systems. "What are you doing?" Julian asked, leaning heavily against the wall as I worked. "Creating a distraction," I replied, hitting the execute command. Instantly, the deafening shriek of the hospital fire alarm echoed through the corridors. Strobe lights began flashing violently, casting harsh red shadows across the white walls. Automated voice systems blared over the intercoms, instructing all personnel and patients to evacuate the building immediately. The hallway outside erupted into absolute chaos. Nurses were shouting, doors were banging open, and security guards were sprinting toward the stairwells to guide patients out. No one was paying attention to the intensive care unit at the end of the hall. "Move," I said, wrapping my arm around Julian's waist again. We pushed through the heavy glass doors, blending into the chaotic rush of medical staff. We kept our heads down, avoiding the main elevators and heading straight for the restricted service corridor. I swiped the unconscious doctor's badge against the electronic card reader. The heavy metal door clicked green and swung open. We slipped inside the dark stairwell, the blaring sound of the fire alarm suddenly muffled by the thick concrete walls. "We cannot take the stairs all the way down." Julian wheezed, his knees buckling slightly. "I cannot walk that far." "We are not taking the stairs," I said, guiding him toward a large metal chute built into the wall. It was the biohazard and laundry disposal tunnel leading directly down to the basement loading dock. It was disgusting and dangerous, but it was our only blind spot. I pried the metal door open. The smell of bleach and soiled linen washed over us. I pushed Julian inside first, climbing in right behind him. We slid down the dark metal chute in a chaotic jumble of limbs, landing hard on a massive pile of hospital laundry bags in the basement holding area. I scrambled off the pile, pulling Julian to his feet. The loading dock was completely deserted, all staff having evacuated due to the alarm. We stumbled out into the cool night air, the distant wail of actual fire engines approaching the main entrance. I had parked my car in the employee overflow lot. It was not the luxury sedan I usually drove to client meetings. It was a battered 10-year-old vehicle I kept registered under a shell company name specifically for situations requiring absolute discretion. It had no tracking systems, no modern navigation, and no digital footprint. I practically shoved Julian into the passenger seat before sprinting around to the driver's side. I jammed the key into the ignition and the old engine roared to life. I threw it into gear and slammed my foot on the gas, tearing out of the parking lot and merging into the heavy Atlanta traffic moving away from the hospital. Julian slumped against the window, taking deep, shuddering breaths. "We made it," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "You actually got us out." "Do not celebrate yet," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "We need to get to my secure server facility on the south side. If Elias and Victoria realize you are missing, they will send everyone they own after us. I need to freeze your financial portfolios before they can access the $2 billion. I steered the car through the dark streets, navigating the back alleys and unlit roads I had known since childhood. My heart was still racing, but a cold, calculating focus had taken over my mind. They thought I was just a naive girl they could bully. They had no idea they had just started a war with a digital predator. We arrived at a nondescript warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Inside, it housed a state-of-the-art server farm operating entirely off the grid. I helped Julian out of the car and supported him as we walked through the heavy steel doors, locking multiple deadbolts behind us. "Sit here," I instructed, guiding him to a leather sofa in the center of the room. I grabbed a bottle of water from a small refrigerator and handed it to him. "Drink this slowly. I am going to access the main terminal and initiate a complete lockdown of your family trust." I walked over to the massive bank of computer monitors illuminating the dark room. I sat down in my chair, cracking my knuckles. I was ready to dismantle Victoria's political shielding and leave Elias with absolutely nothing. I booted up my encrypted laptop and logged into my cybersecurity firm's primary banking portal to prepare for the financial tracing. As the dashboard loaded, a massive red alert window suddenly dominated my screen. The warning chimes blared loudly through the warehouse speakers. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the incoming data packet. My blood turned to ice. "Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He looked up from the sofa, his face pale. "What is it, Jasmine?" I stared at the numbers scrolling rapidly across my screen, unable to process the sheer magnitude of the trap they had just sprung on me. $50 million, I breathed, staring at the transaction receipt. $50 million in untraceable offshore funds had just been routed directly into my independent business account. The money was flagged with multiple international money laundering signatures. "They did not just try to kill you," I said, spinning around to face him. "While they were on that plane, Victoria bypassed my personal firewall. She just dumped $50 million of cartel money into my name." I looked back at the flashing red screen. The transaction history had been artificially manipulated to show years of communication between my server and offshore crime syndicates. "They are framing me." I realized the horrifying truth settling over me. "They are setting me up for massive federal fraud. If the police find us now, they will not just think I kidnapped you. They will think I am a financial terrorist trying to steal your family fortune. We are completely trapped." I stared at the blinking red warning on my monitor, my mind racing to process the sheer evil of their plan. Victoria was sitting in a luxury cabin miles above the earth, casually destroying my life with a few keystrokes. She had not just stolen money. She had weaponized the financial system against me. I routed my connection through a series of ghost servers to mask my physical location. I needed to see exactly what she was doing and who she was talking to. I accessed the flight communication logs, tapping into the air to ground data relay. It was an incredibly illegal maneuver, but I was already being framed for massive federal fraud. I pulled up the audio file of an outgoing phone call made from Victoria's personal device just minutes ago. I traced the receiving number. It was routed directly to the personal cell phone of the Atlanta chief of police. Her father had funded his entire election campaign last year. They played golf together at the country club. I hit play and the sound of Victoria's voice filled the cold, echoing warehouse. She was weeping hysterically. It was a flawless performance of absolute terror. She sounded like a fragile, terrified victim, completely overwhelmed by a sudden, violent nightmare. "Please help me," she sobbed into the phone, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated panic. "My sister-in-law Jasmine has completely lost her mind. She attacked a doctor at the hospital and kidnapped my brother-in-law Julian. He is in a coma. He is completely helpless and she dragged him out of the intensive care unit." The police chief sounded immediately alarmed. He spoke to her with gentle deference, assuring her they would mobilize every unit to find him. He treated her words as absolute gospel without a single question or doubt. Victoria let out a shaky, dramatic breath. "You do not understand," she cried, her voice pitching higher to convey absolute desperation. "Jasmine is from a very bad neighborhood on the south side. She has always been aggressive and unstable. We tried to welcome her into our family, but she never fit in. She is trying to murder Julian so she can steal the family estate. I just received a banking alert from our corporate accounts. She transferred $50 million of dirty money into her own business account. She is going to kill him and disappear into the slums. Please, you have to save him." My hands shook with a rage so pure and hot it burned my chest. She was using every stereotype, every racial bias, and every ounce of her white privilege to paint me as a violent, greedy criminal. She knew exactly how the justice system worked in this city. She knew the police would blindly believe a wealthy white woman crying on the phone over a successful black woman from the South Side. She knew the sudden $50 million fortune in my bank account would erase any benefit of the doubt. Julian groaned from the leather sofa behind me. He had heard the entire recording. His face was twisted in disgust and sorrow. "She is weaponizing her tears," he whispered, his voice raw and raspy. "They are going to send an absolute army after you, Jasmine. She knows they shoot first when it comes to people from your old neighborhood." I was entirely right. I quickly tapped into the local police dispatch frequencies. The radio channels were already buzzing with frantic, overlapping activity. An all-points bulletin had been issued for my immediate arrest. They had my full name, my face, my company address, and my license plate number broadcast to every patrol car in the metropolitan area. Victoria's father had clearly pulled every political string he possessed. The dispatcher announced that I was considered armed and highly dangerous. They warned patrol officers that I had already brutally assaulted medical personnel and kidnapped a critical patient. They were treating me like a domestic terrorist. "We have to move right now," I said, slamming my laptop shut and shoving it deep into my backpack. If Victoria traced the transaction receipt, she might have pinged the general location of this server farm. "We cannot stay here another minute." I hurried over and helped Julian to his feet. He was visibly weakening. The adrenaline that had carried him out of the hospital was fading rapidly, leaving his body to fight the lingering effects of the paralytic poison. His legs buckled slightly, and I had to wrap my arm tightly around his waist to keep him upright. We stumbled back out to the loading dock. The cool night air hit my face, but it brought no relief whatsoever. In the distance, I could hear the unmistakable thwack of helicopter blades chopping heavily through the sky. I looked up and saw the sweeping white searchlights of a police chopper cutting through the darkness over the industrial district. They were scanning the alleyways and empty lots, searching for any sign of movement. "They are moving fast," I said, helping Julian into the passenger seat of the battered 10-year-old car. I threw my bag into the back seat and jumped behind the steering wheel. I shoved the key into the ignition and the old engine sputtered before roaring to life. I did not turn on the headlights. I navigated the narrow alleyway behind the warehouse using only the ambient light spilling from the street lamps above. "This car has no global positioning system and no digital computer module," I told Julian as I carefully steered us away from the main road. "It is completely analog. They cannot track our movements electronically, but we still have to avoid the physical patrols." We drove in tense, suffocating silence. I stayed on the back streets of the South Side using every shortcut and hidden dirt alley I had learned growing up in this rough neighborhood. I knew these broken streets better than any police officer ever could. I knew which roads led to dead ends and which fences had gaps wide enough to drive through. We passed a major intersection, and my breath caught in my throat. I saw two squad cars parked diagonally with their red and blue lights flashing brightly, blocking the entire road. Uniformed officers were standing outside with long rifles scanning every passing vehicle. I quickly shifted into reverse and backed down a side street, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. "They are setting up a perimeter," Julian wheezed, leaning his heavy head against the cold glass of the passenger window. "Victoria wants you caught or killed before her plane lands in Paris. She wants the loose ends tied up permanently." "I am not going to let them put me in a cage," I said, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached with the pressure. "I just need to get us to a safe zone so I can dismantle that $50 million transfer and prove they set me up. I can follow the digital money trail right back to Elias." Suddenly, Julian let out a terrible choking sound. He hunched over violently in his seat, coughing uncontrollably. The sound was wet and deep. I glanced over in pure panic. "Julian, what is wrong?" He could not answer me. Another massive wave of coughing racked his body. He brought his shaking hands up to his mouth, trying to suppress the spasms. When he finally pulled his hands away, they were covered in dark, thick red blood. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car roughly into the deep shadow of an abandoned strip mall. I threw the gearshift into park and reached across the console for him. "Julian," I cried, grabbing a handful of fast food napkins from the glove compartment to wipe his mouth. "You are bleeding. What is happening to your body?" He took a shallow, ragged breath, his skin turning an alarming shade of gray under the dim streetlights, the beta blockers. He whispered weakly, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own struggling lungs. They kept my heart rate low enough to survive the initial dose of the poison, but the heavy toxins are still circulating in my bloodstream. My internal organs are starting to shut down, Jasmine. Panic, cold, and absolute seized my chest. "No," I said, my voice breaking, as I pressed a clean napkin to his lips. "We just got you out of that hospital room. You cannot give up now. We are going to find a private hospital outside the city limits. We will find a doctor who is not on their corporate payroll." He shook his head slowly, more blood staining his white teeth. "Ordinary doctors do not know what Elias used on me. It is a rare synthetic compound. Elias ordered it through a private chemical supplier in Eastern Europe. Normal hospital antidotes will not work on this toxin. Julian gripped my arm, his fingers freezing cold and trembling violently. Elias has the specific antidote. He kept a single vial of it just in case he accidentally exposed himself while handling the poison at the estate. Where is it? I demanded, my mind racing through a dozen impossible scenarios. Tell me exactly where he put it. The wall safe, he gasped, sinking deeper into the passenger seat. He hid the glass vial in the wall safe inside my mother's master bedroom at the estate. He thought it was the absolute last place anyone would ever look for evidence of his crime. Cecilia's mansion. It was located in the wealthiest and most heavily secured gated community in the entire city of Atlanta. I reached into the back seat for my laptop, opening it right there in the dark car. I booted up my encrypted system and tapped into the hidden security cameras I had personally installed at Cecilia's estate last year when they claimed they needed better digital protection. The high-definition video feed loaded onto my screen and my last shred of hope withered into dust. The long, sweeping driveway of the mansion was completely packed with police cruisers. Yellow crime scene tape was strung across the grand iron entrance gates. Heavily armed uniformed officers were patrolling the perimeter with tactical flashlights and canine units. Victoria must have officially claimed the estate as an active crime scene, asserting that I might try to target her home or hide out there to steal more valuables. They have locked down the entire house, I said, staring at the glowing screen in utter despair. There are cops everywhere, Julian. It is a literal fortress right now. Julian closed his eyes, his breathing becoming frighteningly shallow and uneven. Then it is over, he whispered, a single tear slipping down his pale gray cheek. You need to leave me here, Jasmine. Run. Leave the car and disappear into the city. Save yourself before they catch you and lock you away forever. I stared at the man I loved bleeding and dying in the passenger seat of a beat-up analog car while his murderers sipped expensive champagne in the sky. I thought about Victoria crying her fake weaponized tears to the police chief. I thought about Cecilia throwing that release form in my lap and telling me to unplug my husband. I thought about Elias checking his gold watch because my husband's death was making him late for Fashion Week. I closed my laptop and set it gently in the back seat. I leaned over and wiped the remaining blood from Julian's chin. I am not leaving you, I said, my voice stripped of all panic and replaced with a deadly icy calm. You are going to live, Julian, and we are going to watch your family burn to the ground. I put the car back into drive and pulled out of the shadows. I am going to break into that mansion, I told him, staring straight ahead into the dark, treacherous street. I am going to walk right past those cops, and I am going to get that antidote. I steered the heavy analog car away from the industrial district and turned toward the northern suburbs. The transition from the broken pavement of the south side to the smooth, manicured asphalt of Buckhead felt like crossing into another universe. This was where the generational wealth lived. This was where Cecilia's sprawling estate sat behind high iron gates and private security patrols. Julian was taking shallow, gasping breaths in the passenger seat. The gray color of his skin was deepening into something terrifying. Every inhale sounded like wet paper tearing in his chest. I pulled the car off the main road and navigated down a narrow utility access path hidden by a dense line of ancient oak trees. It was the only blind spot in the entire neighborhood. I parked the car deep in the thick brush, turning off the engine so the silence of the woods swallowed us whole. You need to stay right here, I told Julian, pulling my dark jacket tightly around my shoulders. Do not move and do not make a sound. I will be back with the antidote. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed my sleeve. His touch was so weak it broke my heart. Be careful, Jasmine, he whispered, his voice barely a breath. There are armed police everywhere. They will not hesitate to shoot you. I nodded slowly. I knew exactly what the police in this city were capable of when they thought they were protecting the elite from someone who looked like me. I grabbed my backpack, making sure my encrypted laptop was secure inside. I slipped out of the car and crept through the dense underbrush until I reached the towering brick wall that surrounded Cecilia's estate. Through the gaps in the thick ivy, I could see the massive property illuminated by floodlights. There were at least 6 police cruisers parked along the circular driveway. Uniformed officers were standing near the front entrance drinking coffee and laughing, as if this were just another routine guard detail for a wealthy political donor. They thought they had the perimeter locked down tight. They thought nobody could possibly breach a fortress protected by the Atlanta Police Department. But they did not know who built the digital walls they were hiding behind. I crouched low in the damp grass and opened my laptop, balancing it on my knees. The screen glowed faintly in the dark. Last year, Cecilia had complained that her home security system was outdated. She had demanded that my cybersecurity firm install a state-of-the-art upgrade for her massive mansion. She treated me like an unpaid servant the entire time, snapping her fingers at me and complaining about the noise my technicians made. She never even paid the invoice. She claimed my labor was just part of my duty to the family. She had no idea that my duty included writing a custom backdoor protocol directly into the core architecture of her smart home network. I typed a rapid sequence of commands into my terminal. I bypassed the external firewall in less than 10 seconds. I accessed the primary surveillance node and located the 12 high-definition cameras scanning the perimeter. I executed a loop command. I took 30 seconds of static footage and fed it directly into the live monitoring feed. To the police officers looking at the security screens inside their cruisers, the grounds appeared completely empty and still. In reality, I was already moving over the wall. I dropped down onto the soft, manicured lawn, landing silently on the balls of my feet. I darted across the dark, expansive garden, using the deep shadows of the massive marble fountains and trimmed hedges to mask my approach. I could hear the police radios crackling static from the driveway, but they never looked my way. They trusted the digital screens completely. I reached the side entrance of the mansion. It was a heavy, reinforced steel security door, secured by a biometric lock and an alphanumeric keypad. I plugged a small interface cable from my phone directly into the data port hidden beneath the keypad casing. I ran a quick decryption script, and the heavy deadbolt slid back with a soft, satisfying click. I pushed the door open and slipped inside, pulling it silently shut behind me. The interior of the mansion was suffocatingly opulent. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Original oil paintings lined the sweeping, curved staircases. Every surface was covered in imported marble or polished mahogany. It was a monument to Cecilia's obsession with status and wealth. She loved this house more than she loved her own children. I moved silently through the dark, quiet hallways, heading straight for the Grand Master Suite on the second floor. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs with every step I took. If a single police officer decided to patrol the interior of the house, I would be caught instantly. But their arrogance kept them outside, assuming the locked doors were impenetrable. I reached the heavy double doors of the master bedroom and slipped inside. The room smelled of expensive floral perfume and stale privilege. I walked past the massive canopy bed and headed directly for the walk-in closet. Julian had told me the safe was hidden behind a false panel in the back wall. I pushed aside rows of designer dresses and fur coats, feeling a wave of disgust. Victoria and Cecilia had bought these clothes using stolen corporate funds while treating me like dirt. I found the false wooden panel and pressed my hand against the edge. It popped open, revealing a sleek digital wall safe built directly into the reinforced concrete. The keypad required a 6-digit code. I did not have time to run a brute force decryption program. I pulled a small thermal imaging scanner from my backpack and aimed it at the keypad. The screen illuminated the faint residual heat signatures left behind by human fingers. Elias had clearly opened this safe recently, probably right before they left for the airport. I identified the 4 keys that glowed the brightest. It only took me 3 attempts to arrange the numbers in the correct sequence. The electronic lock beeped happily and the heavy steel door swung open. Inside the safe, sitting on a velvet shelf, was a small clear glass vial filled with a pale blue liquid. The antidote. I grabbed it immediately, wrapping my fingers tightly around the cold glass. I shoved it deep into the front pocket of my dark jacket. I had what I came for. Julian was going to survive. I was about to close the safe when something else caught my eye. Tucked beneath a stack of stock certificates was a thick leather-bound book. It looked incredibly out of place among the modern digital storage drives and legal folders. It was a physical analog ledger. My instincts as a forensic accountant flared to life. Wealthy criminals always made the same fatal mistake. They distrusted digital banking when it came to their dirtiest money because they knew people like me could hack it. They always kept a shadow ledger written by hand to keep track of the real numbers. I pulled the heavy book from the safe and flipped it open. I pulled a small penlight from my pocket and directed the narrow beam across the pages. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the columns of numbers and handwritten notes, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of the betrayal recorded on the crisp white paper. It was a meticulous, detailed record of complete financial devastation. Elias and Victoria had not just been siphoning money for designer bags and luxury vacations. They had systematically embezzled $2 billion from Julian's primary investment fund over the course of 3 years. I turned the pages, my hands shaking with absolute fury as I read the routing notes. Victoria had been funneling massive amounts of liquid capital directly into a network of shell companies registered in her father's name. She had stolen from a black-owned business empire to bankroll the political campaign of a white conservative senator who actively legislated against communities like the one I grew up in. And the worst part was written right there in the margins. Cecilia knew. The ledger contained multiple authorization signatures from my mother-in-law. Cecilia had discovered the embezzlement 2 years ago, but instead of protecting her son and his company, she had struck a deal with Victoria. Cecilia allowed them to drain Julian's life work as long as they secretly funded her extravagant gambling debts and maintained her status in the elite country club circles. They had all conspired to bleed Julian dry. And when Julian finally started asking questions and scheduling audits, they decided it was easier to poison him than to face the consequences. They murdered him, or tried to murder him simply to cover their tracks and keep their stolen wealth. The sheer depth of their evil was staggering. I pulled my phone out and quickly snapped dozens of high-resolution photos of the ledger pages. I needed digital backups of every single signature and routing number. I shoved the heavy leather book into my backpack, pulling the straps tight. This was the key to destroying them all. This ledger would put Victoria's father in federal prison right alongside Cecilia and Elias. I turned to leave the master closet, eager to get back to Julian and administer the antidote. Suddenly, a sharp electronic chime echoed through the silent bedroom. I froze. The sound came from the smart home control panel mounted on the wall near the door. The digital screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across the dark room. The heavy oak double doors of the master bedroom suddenly slammed shut on their own. I heard the loud, aggressive mechanical clank of the electronic deadbolt sliding into place, locking me inside. A deep mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. The thick steel security shutters hidden in the window frames suddenly dropped down with a terrifying crash, sealing off the large glass windows and blocking out the moonlight. The room was instantly plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. I rushed to the heavy wooden doors, grabbing the brass handles and pulling with all my strength. They did not budge a single millimeter. I pounded my fists against the thick wood, but it was useless. The smart home system had engaged a complete environmental lockdown. The speakers embedded in the ceiling hissed with static before a voice crackled through the intercom system. It was a voice coming through a digital internet protocol connection, probably routed through a satellite connection from 30,000 feet in the air. Well, 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 the voice echoed through the dark bedroom, dripping with arrogant amusement. Look who decided to walk right into my trap. It was Elias. He was calling from the first-class cabin of the airplane somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. Did you really think you were the only one who understood network security, Jasmine? He mocked, his voice distorted by the satellite delay. You built the back door into my mother's house, but I am the one who pays the monitoring company. The system alerted me the second you bypassed the perimeter cameras. I knew you would come looking for the antidote. You are so predictably loyal to my pathetic brother. I backed away from the doors, staring up at the dark ceiling. I could hear the faint sound of the ventilation system shifting gears. The air conditioning stopped blowing cold air. A low, ominous rattling noise started in the walls. I hope you found the ledger while you were in the safe. Elias continued, his tone turning cold and vicious. I hope you read every page. I want you to know exactly how much we took before you die. Julian never deserved that empire. I was too soft. My wife and I are putting that money to real use. We are building a political dynasty. You are not building anything, Elias, I said, knowing the microphones in the room were picking up my voice. You are a weak, pathetic coward who had to drug his own brother because you were too stupid to run a company yourself. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation sees this ledger, you are going to spend the rest of your life in a federal cell. Elias laughed. It was a hollow, cruel sound. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is never going to see that ledger, Jasmine, because you are never leaving that room. I just triggered the remote emergency protocol. The system thinks there is a catastrophic biochemical hazard in the master suite. The rattling sound in the walls grew louder. I smelled something sharp and acrid filtering through the air conditioning vents. It was smoke. Thick black chemical smoke began pouring into the locked room, filling the space with blinding speed. The emergency protocol incinerates the hazard zone, Elias explained calmly over the intercom. The room is sealed tight. The temperature is going to rise rapidly. The smoke will suffocate you in minutes, and then the incendiary devices will scrub the room completely clean. The police outside will just think you accidentally triggered a fire while trying to rob my mother. They will find your burned body and the burned ledger, and the entire world will believe the violent black girl from the South Side finally got exactly what she deserved. The smoke was already burning my eyes and stinging my throat. I coughed, pulling the collar of my dark jacket up over my mouth and nose. The temperature in the room was rising fast, turning the air into a suffocating blanket of heat. "Goodbye, Jasmine," Elias said, his voice fading out as the connection terminated. "Tell my brother I said hello when you see him in hell." The intercom clicked off, leaving me trapped in the burning darkness. The thick smoke was filling the room from top to bottom, forcing me to drop down to the floor to find breathable air. The heavy steel shutters on the windows and the electronic deadbolts on the doors made the room a perfect airtight tomb. My chest heaved as I struggled to breathe. I reached into my pocket and closed my fingers around the cold glass vial of the antidote. I thought about Julian bleeding and dying in the dark analog car outside, waiting for me to save him. I thought about Victoria and Cecilia sipping champagne in the sky, believing they had won. I was not going to burn in this gilded cage. I was going to break out, and I was going to unleash absolute digital hell on every single one of them. The air inside the master bedroom grew impossibly thick and toxic. Thick black chemical smoke poured from the ventilation shafts, filling the space with blinding speed. I crawled across the expensive imported hardwood floor, keeping my face as close to the ground as possible to find breathable oxygen. The heavy solid oak doors were sealed shut by electronic deadbolts. The smart home system had engaged a complete environmental lockdown, trapping me inside what was rapidly becoming a burning tomb. I knew the architecture of this specific security system intimately because I had designed the network upgrades myself. Every smart lock possessed a physical fail-safe mechanism to prevent entrapment during a total power loss. I just needed to cut the electrical current to this specific room without triggering the secondary backup generators located in the basement. The heat in the enclosed space was becoming absolutely unbearable. My lungs burned with every shallow breath I managed to take. I pulled myself up toward the glowing smart home control panel mounted near the heavy wooden door frame. I removed the thick leather-bound ledger from my backpack. I used the solid spine of the heavy book to smash directly into the glowing digital screen. The glass surface shattered into pieces, cutting my hands. I reached my bare fingers into the jagged opening in the wall, ignoring the sharp, stinging pain as broken glass sliced my skin. I felt around blindly in the dark cavity until I found the main power bus wiring. I gripped the thick cables and ripped them out of the drywall with every ounce of upper body strength I possessed. Sparks showered over my dark jacket, illuminating the smoke-filled room for a brief second. The electronic deadbolts on the heavy oak doors immediately disengaged with a loud, heavy click. I shoved the heavy doors open and stumbled out into the grand hallway. The emergency destruction protocol Elias had triggered from the airplane was already spreading rapidly through the entire estate. Small incendiary charges planted secretly in the ventilation shafts by his security contractors were popping like terrifying firecrackers. The rich velvet curtains and imported silk rugs were catching fire instantly. The flames spread up the sweeping mahogany staircases, consuming the antique oil paintings hanging on the walls. The smoke alarms were screaming throughout the mansion, but the heavily armed police officers stationed outside still thought it was just a standard security breach. They had absolutely no idea the house was actively trying to incinerate everything inside, including me. I sprinted down the back servant stairs, coughing violently, as the thick black smoke chased me down the narrow corridor. I needed a vehicle fast enough to outrun the police perimeter and heavy enough to break through the reinforced security barriers surrounding the property. I burst through the heavy fire doors leading directly into Cecilia's private subterranean garage. The space was massive and pristine, looking exactly like a luxury car showroom. Sitting directly in the center under a gleaming overhead spotlight was Cecilia's absolute pride and joy. It was a vintage bright red Ferrari. She had purchased the classic sports car using the exact same stolen funds she took from Julian's investment empire. It was an entirely analog machine, meaning it possessed no remote kill switches and no digital tracking systems that Elias could exploit from his first-class cabin. I did not have the keys, but I did not need them. I had spent my teenage years growing up on the rough streets of the South Side, learning how to survive harsh conditions. Sometimes survival meant knowing exactly how to bypass an older ignition cylinder. I grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the polished garage tool bench and smashed the driver's side window. The glass shattered outward, hitting the pristine concrete floor. I reached inside the vehicle and unlocked the heavy door, sweeping the remaining broken glass off the soft leather seat. I climbed behind the steering wheel and ducked under the steering column, pulling down the plastic housing with my bare hands. I found the ignition wires, easily stripping the thick rubber casing away with my teeth. I twisted the exposed copper wires together. The classic 12-cylinder engine roared to life with a deafening, aggressive snarl that literally shook the concrete walls of the underground garage. I strapped my backpack tightly to the passenger seat, securing the glass vial of the antidote and the leather ledger. I slammed the heavy metal gearshift into drive and pressed my foot hard against the accelerator pedal. The wide tires spun furiously against the polished garage floor, screaming and burning thick white rubber before finally catching traction. I aimed the heavy sloping nose of the red Ferrari directly at the reinforced glass garage doors blocking my exit. The main floor of the mansion above me collapsed at that exact moment with a terrifying explosive boom, sending a massive shockwave of blistering heat and burning debris raining down around the car. I braced myself against the leather steering wheel as the vintage sports car smashed through the reinforced security glass, shattering it into a million glittering pieces. The police officers stationed in the circular driveway jumped back in absolute shock as the bright red Ferrari exploded out of the burning garage. I drifted the heavy car hard across the manicured front lawn, tearing up the expensive landscaping and destroying a marble fountain as I aimed straight for the main iron entry gates. Several police officers drew their weapons and shouted frantic orders. I could not hear over the screaming engine. I hit the heavy iron gates at 60 miles per hour. The rusted metal hinges snapped instantly under the extreme force of the impact, and the massive gates flew completely open. I fishtailed out onto the dark suburban street, pressing the gas pedal all the way to the floorboards. The police sirens erupted behind me almost immediately. It was a chaotic chorus of wailing alarms and flashing red and blue lights, multiplying by the second in my rearview mirror. I navigated the winding, treacherous roads of the wealthy Buckhead neighborhood at terrifying speeds. The vintage Ferrari was incredibly difficult to handle, requiring pure physical strength to steer through the sharp, winding curves. I watched the rearview mirror, seeing a massive convoy of police cruisers desperately trying to close the gap. I needed to upload the high-resolution photos of the ledger before the police ran me off the road or shot out my tires. If they caught me right now with the physical book, they would absolutely destroy the evidence to protect Victoria's powerful political family. I reached over and grabbed my encrypted laptop, flipping the screen open on the passenger seat with one hand, while keeping the speeding car steady with my other hand. I connected my mobile phone via a physical data cable and initiated a massive data transfer directly to my highly secure Ghost server. The upload progress bar appeared on the glowing screen, inching forward agonizingly slowly as the car sped through the dark streets. A police helicopter spotlight suddenly swept across the road directly ahead of me, illuminating the dark asphalt in a blinding, harsh white glare. I swerved the steering wheel hard, taking a sharp right turn onto an abandoned industrial access road leading toward the old downtown rail yards. The heavy suspension of the Ferrari rattled violently as the tires hit the uneven, broken gravel. I knew this specific industrial area perfectly. There was a narrow concrete service tunnel running directly beneath the active freight train tracks. The modern police cruisers were far too wide and heavy to navigate it safely at high speeds. I glanced over and checked the upload progress on the laptop screen. It was at exactly 90%. The police sirens were getting dangerously close, echoing loudly off the rusted metal shipping containers surrounding the dark rail yard. I hit the entrance of the pitch-black concrete tunnel, barely slowing the vehicle down. The sound of the screaming engine was completely deafening inside the narrow enclosed space. Sparks flew as the side mirrors scraped against the rough concrete walls. I emerged on the other side of the tunnel into a sprawling maze of abandoned brick warehouses just as the upload progress bar hit 100%. The ledger data was permanently secured in the cloud, out of their corrupt reach forever. I immediately killed the headlights and coasted the red sports car deep into the heavy shadows of a massive empty storage facility, cutting the engine completely. I sat in the absolute darkness of the car, listening to the police sirens fade into the distance as they hopelessly searched the wrong side of the train tracks. My hands were shaking violently as I pulled the cold glass vial of the antidote from my jacket pocket, holding it up to the faint moonlight to ensure it was not broken. It was perfectly intact. Julian was going to survive this nightmare. I looked back down at the glowing laptop screen, analyzing the complex routing numbers I had just uploaded from the ledger, alongside the banking alerts from my own compromised security system. The terrible truth of their ultimate financial plan materialized on the screen before my eyes. The entire $2 billion was not just sitting safely in local political shell companies. It was actively being routed through a highly complex web of digital waypoints directly into heavily fortified Swiss bank accounts. The massive fortune was currently in a temporary digital holding state, waiting for final international authorization. That authorization required a physical biometric scan from Victoria upon her arrival at the international banking branch in France. I quickly opened a new tab and checked the live flight status tracker. The airplane carrying my murderous in-laws was exactly 4 hours away from landing at the airport in Paris. In exactly 4 hours, Victoria would step off that luxurious plane walk into a private banking suite and press her thumb to a glass scanner. The moment her biometric signature was verified, the $2 billion would vanish into an untraceable black hole forever. They would become completely untouchable. And I would be left standing in Atlanta, carrying the absolute full weight of a federal murder and financial fraud conviction, with absolutely no way to prove my innocence to the world. I stared at the glowing screen for one more agonizing second before slamming the laptop shut. I threw the computer into the passenger seat and slammed my foot heavily on the gas pedal. I had to get back to Julian. The vintage Ferrari engine roared as I tore down the dark industrial access roads, leaving the abandoned train yards far behind me. I navigated the confusing maze of back streets until I finally reached the dense line of ancient oak trees where I had hidden my analog car. I killed the roaring engine and grabbed my heavy backpack from the passenger seat. I sprinted through the damp brush, my heart pounding furiously against my ribs with every step. I found the old car exactly where I left it, but Julian was completely unresponsive. He was slumped against the passenger window, his skin an absolute terrifying shade of pale blue in the moonlight. He was barely breathing. Julian. I cried, opening the heavy car door and pulling his limp body toward me. I reached into my dark jacket pocket with trembling hands and pulled out the small glass vial. I twisted the sealed cap off with my teeth. I tilted his head back and poured the pale blue liquid directly into his mouth, massaging his cold throat to force his muscles to swallow the antidote. I sat there in the dark, freezing woods, holding his heavy body against mine, praying to God that I was not too late. Seconds felt like agonizing hours. Then his chest heaved violently. He sucked in a massive, ragged breath and began coughing hard into the night air. The terrifying gray color in his cheeks slowly began to recede, replaced by the faintest flush of actual life. He opened his dark eyes and looked up at my face. You got it, he whispered, his voice incredibly weak but remarkably clear. I got the antidote, I said, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. And I got the physical ledger from the wall safe. I know everything, Julian. I know exactly what Elias and Victoria did. We are going to completely destroy them. We cannot stay here, I told him, helping him sit up properly in the passenger seat. The police are going to expand their search grid the second they find that burning mansion. We need a secure location to fight this digital war. I left the stolen red Ferrari hidden deep in the thick brush, knowing the police would eventually find it but hoping it would buy us a few precious hours. I climbed into the driver's seat of my analog car and started the unreliable engine. I drove us quickly back toward the very heart of the South Side. I owned an old abandoned textile factory right in the center of the toughest neighborhood in Atlanta. I bought the property years ago under a blind corporate trust to use as a disaster recovery site. It looked like a decaying brick building with broken windows from the outside, but the basement housed a military-grade digital command center. It was my ultimate uncrackable safe house. We pulled into the hidden underground garage, and I helped Julian inside the building. He was regaining his physical strength quickly, as the antidote neutralized the deadly paralytic poison in his veins. We walked down a long, dark concrete corridor until we reached a heavy steel blast door. I entered a complex biometric scan, and the massive door hissed open, revealing a huge dark room filled with high-performance server racks and multiple ultra-wide monitors. I settled Julian onto a medical cot I kept in the corner for late-night coding sessions and immediately walked over to the primary workstation. I booted up the main terminal, bringing all 6 monitors to life at once. The massive screens glowed brightly, illuminating the cold concrete walls with streaming lines of data. I have exactly 4 hours before their private plane lands in Paris. I told Julian, my fingers hovering over the illuminated mechanical keyboard. I need to intercept the $2 billion before Victoria walks into that Swiss bank branch and verifies her biometric signature. I launched my proprietary network intrusion software and dove straight into the international banking grid. I tracked the massive bundle of stolen funds easily using the routing numbers I photographed from the physical ledger. The money was currently fragmented, bouncing rapidly between dozens of offshore holding accounts to mask its final destination. I initiated a series of aggressive digital roadblocks. I wrote custom code to freeze the routing protocols, attempting to lock the money securely in transit. But the exact moment I engaged my external firewall, the opposing system pushed back with terrifying destructive force. Massive red warning banners flooded all 6 of my screens simultaneously. My defensive walls were being systematically dismantled from the outside in real time. Victoria and Elias had not just hired a standard accounting firm to hide their massive theft. They had retained a team of elite underground information technology mercenaries. These were highly paid professional cybercriminals operating out of unregulated international territories. They were actively fighting my code right now. I typed furiously, launching a secondary offensive protocol. I tried to sever the direct connection between the offshore shell companies and the Swiss routing nodes. The mercenary hackers retaliated instantly by flooding my terminal with a distributed denial of service attack. They were sending millions of phantom data packets trying to crash my servers and blind my tracking software. I diverted auxiliary power to my server cooling systems and rerouted my connection through a dozen international proxies to keep my terminal stable. It was a brutal, exhausting digital tug-of-war. Every single time I managed to lock down $1 million, they used a dark web legal loophole or an automated routing script to bypass my block and push the stolen money forward. My fingers flew across the keyboard, aching with the frantic, desperate pace. Sweat dripped down my face as I stared at the scrolling walls of complex code. They had an entire team of master hackers working simultaneously from multiple locations while I was fighting them completely alone in a basement. Julian stood up from the cot and walked slowly over to my workstation, leaning heavily against the wooden desk. His dark eyes scanned the monitors, watching the fierce battle unfolding in the endless streams of code. "They are using automated algorithmic routing," he said, his voice tight with deep worry. "They have set up thousands of dummy accounts to split the money into microscopic fractions. You cannot block them all, Jasmine. There are simply too many pathways for the money to travel. I am not going to let them steal your life work, I said, gritting my teeth as I launched another aggressive wave of defensive protocols. I am going to freeze every single cent they took. Suddenly, the primary monitor flashed blindingly white, and all the tracking code completely vanished. A solid black screen appeared in its place. A bright green audio waveform pulsed directly in the center of the screen, indicating an incoming voice over Internet Protocol connection. The mercenary hackers had bypassed my audio firewall and forced a direct communication link to my speakers. The studio monitors on my desk crackled to life with crisp, clear audio. The transmission was coming directly from the first-class cabin of the private jet, currently flying 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. "Are you really still trying to fight us, Jasmine?" The voice echoed through the cold concrete room. It was Victoria. She sounded incredibly relaxed, sipping what sounded like a crystal glass of expensive champagne. I stared at the pulsing green waveform, my blood boiling with absolute furious rage. I tapped a specific key on my board to open my microphone. "You are not going to get away with this, Victoria," I said, my voice low and incredibly dangerous. "I have the physical ledger from the safe. I know you embezzled $2 billion to fund your father's corrupt political campaign. I know Cecilia authorized it to pay her gambling debts. I have already uploaded the photographic proof to a secure cloud server." Victoria let out a soft, elegant laugh. It was the condescending laugh of a woman who had never faced a single consequence in her entire privileged life. "You really do not understand how the real world works, do you?" She mocked, her tone dripping with elitist superiority. "You think some digital pictures of an old book are going to take down a United States senator. My father has federal judges and Supreme Court justices dining at his estate every single weekend. We control the entire narrative, Jasmine. We always have." She paused, letting her cruel words sink into the silent room. "Right now, the entire city of Atlanta thinks you are a violent, unhinged criminal," she continued, taking another slow sip of her drink. "The chief of police is a personal friend of my family. He has ordered a massive statewide manhunt just for you. The local media is broadcasting your face on every channel right now, painting you as a greedy thug from the South Side who snapped and tried to murder her wealthy husband. Who do you think the authorities are going to believe, Jasmine? A wealthy, respectable white woman from a prominent political family, or a black girl from the hood with a history of living in the projects?" Her blatant racism and absolute entitlement hung in the air, filling the room with toxic, suffocating arrogance. Julian stood beside me, his hands clenching into tight fists as he listened to his sister-in-law dehumanize me. "You have completely lost Jasmine," Victoria said, her voice hardening into a vicious, absolute command. "You are nothing but collateral damage to us. Give up right now. Stop trying to block the financial transfers. The justice system was built specifically to protect people like me and to absolutely crush people like you. When this plane lands in Paris, we will secure the funds in the Swiss accounts, and you will either be gunned down by the police in the streets or locked in a federal prison for the rest of your miserable life. You are done." The audio connection terminated with a sharp electronic click, returning my monitor to the complex scrolling code of the hacker war. The mercenary team was actively using her distraction to push another $50 million across the digital border. Julian looked down at me, his eyes filled with profound sorrow and fierce protective anger. "Jasmine," he whispered, "we need to disconnect the servers right now. She is absolutely right about the police in this city. They will shoot you on sight without asking a single question. We need to focus on running. We can use the analog car to get out of the state before sunrise. We can figure out how to fight them later." I sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the multiple monitors. The chaotic string of numbers reflected in my dark eyes. Victoria thought she had me completely cornered like a frightened animal. She thought her immense wealth and her skin color made her an untouchable god. She thought the legal system would automatically destroy me just because of the neighborhood where I grew up. I slowly leaned back in my heavy leather chair. A cold, dark smile spread across my face. I reached out and placed my hands back on the mechanical keyboard, feeling the familiar keys beneath my fingertips. "I am not going to run, Julian," I said, my voice eerily calm and entirely devoid of fear. "I am going to give Victoria exactly what she wants. I am going to stop blocking the transfers right now." Julian stared at me in complete, utter confusion. What do you mean you are going to stop? If that money reaches the Swiss banking sector, it disappears forever. It goes into decentralized, anonymous accounts guarded by international banking secrecy laws. We will never be able to trace it again. I will not need to trace it. I replied, my fingers beginning to type a completely new and highly complex sequence of code. Because I am going to attach something very special to the money before it gets there. I opened a highly classified experimental program I had been developing secretly for federal cyber defense contracts. It was a piece of digital architecture known in the underground hacker community as a parasite code. What is a parasite code? Julian asked, watching my screen intently as I compiled the massive complex data packet. It is a self-replicating digital tracker, I explained, hitting the execute command to bind the code directly into the massive stream of illicit funds flying across my screen. It does not block the money from moving forward. It actually rides the money. It attaches itself to the unique digital metadata signature of every single dollar they are currently transferring to Europe. I watched the screen as the mercenary hackers easily pushed past my intentionally lowered defenses. They must have thought I finally gave up in despair, just like Victoria commanded me to do. They began routing the massive $2 billion fortune straight into the final holding accounts in France with incredible blazing speed. When Victoria walks into that private banking suite in Paris, I continued, never taking my eyes off the rapidly scrolling screen. She is going to provide her physical biometric scan to authorize the final deposit. She thinks that thumbprint scan will make the money vanish into a safe black hole where no one can ever touch it. I hit the final entry key, cementing the parasite code deeply into their financial transaction loop, ensuring it could never be removed by their mercenary team. But the exact millisecond her thumbprint hits that glass scanner, I said, leaning back and folding my arms, the parasite code will fully activate. It will instantly override the strict Swiss bank privacy protocols and broadcast the true origin of the stolen funds directly to the International Criminal Police Organization, known as Interpol. Julian gasped, his eyes widening dramatically as he realized the sheer brilliant magnitude of my digital trap. It will not just flag the money, I told him, turning to look at his shocked, handsome face. It will automatically transmit the entire photographic ledger, the absolute proof of the assassination attempt on your life, and the direct, undeniable link to her father's corrupt political campaign straight to the highest levels of international law enforcement. The French authorities will have an absolute ironclad legal mandate to arrest them all before they even leave the bank lobby. I looked back at the screen, watching the $2 billion safely arrive in the European holding accounts, perfectly infected with my silent digital parasite. Victoria thinks her privilege makes her completely untouchable, I whispered, staring at the blinking green confirmation light on the monitor. She is about to find out that privilege means absolutely nothing when you trigger a global federal trap. Let her land in Paris. She is walking straight into her own funeral. I kept my eyes locked on the blinking green light on my monitor. The parasite code was successfully embedded, waiting silently in the dark digital corridors of the Swiss banking network. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling the adrenaline begin to settle into a cold, calculating rhythm. I had secured the trap, but I was not finished yet. I needed to see exactly how comfortable my enemies were right now. I typed a new sequence into my terminal, bypassing the basic administrative firewalls I had used earlier. I pushed much deeper into the internal network of the private jet currently flying 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. It was an incredibly illegal maneuver, but I was already the target of a massive statewide manhunt based entirely on lies. I accessed the commercial aviation data stream and tapped directly into the aircraft's internal security cameras. A high-definition video feed popped onto my center monitor, showing the luxurious interior of the first-class cabin. I wanted to see the exact expressions on their faces. I wanted to watch them celebrate their false victory. The cabin looked like a five-star hotel floating in the clouds. The lighting was soft and warm, reflecting off the polished wood paneling and the plush cream-colored leather seats. Victoria was lounging in a wide reclining chair, wearing a silk blindfold pushed up onto her forehead. She held a crystal flute of expensive champagne in one hand. She was laughing with her head thrown back, a picture of absolute careless privilege. Elias sat across from her, looking incredibly smug. He had his custom-tailored jacket off and his sleeves rolled up completely relaxed. He looked like a man who believed he had just successfully murdered his own brother and inherited a $2 billion kingdom. Cecilia was seated in the adjoining private suite getting a hand massage from a dedicated flight attendant. She looked completely unbothered by the fact that she had just authorized the incineration of her own beautiful home just to trap and kill me. They were clinking their glasses together, toasting to their flawless execution of the plan. I engaged the audio feed, listening to their sickening celebration echo through my dark concrete warehouse. "I cannot believe how perfectly it all worked out," Victoria bragged, taking another slow sip of her champagne. "The police chief practically promised me he would have his officers shoot on sight if they found her near the estate. She is probably a pile of ashes in the master bedroom right now, along with that ridiculous physical ledger." Elias smiled, leaning back and resting his hands behind his head. Julian was always too weak to make the hard choices necessary for this level of generational wealth, Elias said, his voice dripping with arrogance. He cared too much about doing things the right way. "It is incredibly satisfying to finally take my rightful place at the head of the family." He raised his glass toward Victoria, and they shared a look of pure malicious triumph. I watched them gloat, my stomach churning with absolute disgust. They were celebrating a murder they thought they had just committed. They felt completely untouchable, protected by Victoria's powerful political connections and Cecilia's elite social standing. They thought the money was already theirs. But they had absolutely no idea that their entire world was about to collapse right out from under them. I minimized the video feed and turned my attention to my secondary monitors. It was time to strip Victoria of her absolute greatest weapon. Her father was a highly influential conservative senator who used his power to shield his family from any legal consequences whatsoever. He was the sole reason the Atlanta police were currently hunting me down like a dangerous animal. I needed to cut off the head of the snake right now. I opened the secure cloud server where I had uploaded the high-resolution photographs of the physical ledger. The pages contained undeniable, irrefutable proof that Victoria's father had been secretly funding his massive re-election campaign using the $2 billion embezzled directly from Julian's investment fund. The paper trail was absolute perfection. It showed offshore routing numbers, fake shell companies, and the senator's own digital authorization signatures accepting the dirty money. I did not just send this information to the local police department. The local police were already bought and paid for by his political machine. I needed someone who hated Victoria's father enough to bypass the local corruption and go straight to the federal level. I ran a quick search and found the senator's most aggressive political rival. He was a ruthless district attorney who was currently running against him for the highly contested Senate seat. He had been desperately searching for dirt on Victoria's family for months, trying to find a way to destroy their pristine public image. I compiled the photographs and the digital banking logs into a single heavily encrypted data packet. I used a ghost email address, routing the message through a dozen random servers in Eastern Europe to completely mask my digital identity and physical location. I attached a simple text note to the file. It said, "Here is the complete financial proof of your opponent's massive embezzlement and money laundering network. Use it quickly before he destroys the evidence." I hit send, watching the progress bar flash briefly before confirming the secure delivery. Now all I had to do was wait for the explosion. I opened a live streaming feed of the local Atlanta news channels on my third monitor. I sat back in my heavy leather chair watching the silent broadcast play out across the screen. Julian walked slowly over and stood behind me, resting his hands gently on my shoulders. The antidote had completely flushed the paralytic poison from his system. His skin was warm again, and his breathing was steady and deep. He watched the news feed with me, his jaw clenched tight with anticipation. We only had to wait 45 minutes. The breaking news banner suddenly flashed across the screen in bright red letters. The regular morning broadcast was abruptly interrupted by live helicopter footage. I turned up the volume on the desk speakers, letting the urgent voice of the news anchor fill the basement room. A frantic reporter announced that a massive, unannounced federal raid was currently underway at the private estate of a prominent local senator. The aerial camera showed dozens of black sports utility vehicles swarming the massive property in Buckhead. Heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, wearing tactical gear, were storming the manicured lawns and smashing through the front doors of the senator's massive mansion. The local police officers who usually protected the estate were completely sidelined, forced to stand back helplessly, while the federal agents executed their overwhelming surprise raid. The news camera zoomed in closely as the front doors opened. The powerful, untouchable senator, the man who had ordered a violent manhunt for me just hours ago, was marched out of his own beautiful home in heavy steel handcuffs. He looked disheveled and absolutely terrified, wearing a silk bathrobe, as the federal agents pushed him roughly into the back of a black government vehicle. The news anchor reported breathlessly that anonymous financial documents had triggered an immediate federal investigation into massive campaign finance fraud and international money laundering. They stated that the evidence was so overwhelming that a federal judge had signed the arrest warrant in the middle of the night. Julian let out a low breath, staring at the monitor in absolute awe. "You just took down one of the most powerful politicians in the state without even leaving this basement," he whispered, his fingers squeezing my shoulders gently. I leaned back, looking up at his handsome face. "I told you I was going to burn their world to the ground," I replied, my voice perfectly calm. "Victoria's political shield is completely gone forever. She has absolutely no one left to protect her when she lands in Europe. Her father cannot make a single phone call to save her now, because he is sitting in a cold federal interrogation room without his cell phone." Julian looked away from the news broadcast and turned his attention back to the live video feed from the airplane. Elias and Victoria were still laughing and drinking their champagne, entirely oblivious to the fact that their entire corrupt empire had just been publicly demolished on national television. They were celebrating a victory that had already turned to ash. A dark, intense fire ignited in Julian's eyes. He had spent the last 3 days trapped inside a paralyzed body, listening to these terrible people plot his murder and violently mock his wife. He had been completely voiceless and helpless while they planned to steal his entire life work. But he was not helpless anymore. He was fully awake, and he was furious. "Jasmine," he said, his voice steady and vibrating with a terrifying, controlled fury, "I want to look them in the eye. I want them to know exactly why their plan failed before they even touch the ground in Paris." I looked at the airplane video feed, and a slow, dark smile spread across my face. "I can do much better than just looking them in the eye, Julian," I said, my fingers flying back to the mechanical keyboard. I accessed the airplane's onboard entertainment network. It was a standalone system completely separate from the critical flight controls, but it was directly linked to every single ultra-high-definition screen in the first-class cabin. I bypassed the basic administrative passwords and took complete remote control of the media broadcasting system. I activated the small hidden webcams mounted on the thick bezels of their personal entertainment screens, ensuring I could record their exact reactions from multiple angles. Then I opened a direct secure video link from my primary workstation webcam and routed it straight into their luxury cabin. I made sure the audio was turned up to maximum volume on their individual headsets. "The system is completely yours," I told Julian, sliding out of my heavy leather chair and gesturing for him to take a seat in front of the glowing camera monitor. "They think you are a burning corpse in a locked room. Let us show them exactly what a resurrection looks like." Julian sat down in front of the monitor, staring directly into the camera lens with a look of pure, lethal vengeance, ready to deliver the ultimate shock to the family that had betrayed him. I pressed the final execution command on my mechanical keyboard, sending a massive encrypted override signal directly to the commercial satellite orbiting above the Earth. The signal beamed down through the atmosphere and slammed straight into the internal network of the private jet flying 30,000 feet over the ocean. I watched the live security feed on my monitor as the luxurious first-class cabin was suddenly plunged into complete digital chaos. The soft classical music playing through the overhead speakers abruptly cut off. The ambient lighting flickered and dimmed, leaving the cabin bathed in the harsh, cold glow of the individual entertainment monitors mounted in front of every single seat. For a few seconds, Victoria, Elias, and Cecilia just looked around in mild annoyance, assuming it was a simple electrical glitch. Victoria tapped her manicured fingernails against her armrest, letting out an irritated sigh. Elias motioned for the flight attendant, demanding to know why his movie had stopped playing. Then every single screen in the entire cabin turned pitch black. A moment later, the screens flared blindingly bright and Julian's face filled every single monitor in the airplane. The reaction was absolute instant pandemonium. Cecilia let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that overloaded the tiny hidden microphones I had activated in the cabin. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the floor, spilling expensive alcohol all over her designer shoes. She scrambled backward in her wide leather seat, pressing her back hard against the window as if she was trying to physically escape the monitor. Elias looked like he had just been struck by lightning. The smug, arrogant smile he had been wearing for the last 3 days completely evaporated. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of chalky white. His mouth hung open in silent, sheer horror as he stared at the face of the brother he thought he had murdered. Victoria dropped her silk blindfold, her blue eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. She gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. For a long, agonizing minute, nobody in the cabin dared to move or breathe. They were staring at a ghost. They thought the dead had come back to haunt them at 30,000 feet in the sky. "Hello, family," Julian said, his voice booming through the cabin speakers. It was loud, clear, and vibrating with an intense, lethal calmness. "I hear you are having a wonderful flight." Elias threw his hands over his face, letting out a pathetic whimpering sound. "He is dead," Elias stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "This is a trick. He is dead. I saw him die. I saw the monitor flatline." "You saw exactly what I wanted you to see," Elias Julian replied, leaning closer to the camera lens, so his dark, piercing eyes seemed to stare directly into his brother's soul. "You are not nearly as smart as you think you are. You never were. Did you really think you could slip poison into my drink and I would just quietly fade away so you could steal everything I built?" Cecilia was hyperventilating, clutching her chest as she stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. "Julian." She gasped, tears of panic streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "You are alive. My baby boy, you are alive. Praise God, it is a miracle." Julian let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed through the airplane cabin. "Do not play the relieved mother with me, Cecilia," he said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "I was completely paralyzed on that hospital bed. I was entirely conscious while you threw a stack of bills at my wife and told her to unplug my life support. I heard every single cruel word you said to Jasmine. I listened to you complain about missing Fashion Week while you thought I was suffocating to death right in front of you." Cecilia's fake tears stopped instantly. Her face shifted from feigned relief to absolute cornered panic. She looked wildly around the cabin as if searching for a way out of the flying metal tube. "Julian, please, you have to understand," she pleaded, her voice turning desperate and shrill. "I did not know what Elias was planning. I swear to you, I had no idea he was going to hurt you. He told me you had a natural heart attack. He lied to me, Julian. He forced me to go along with the estate transition. I am your mother, I would never harm you." Elias snapped his head toward Cecilia, his eyes blazing with furious betrayal. "You lying snake!" Elias shouted, pointing a shaking finger at his own mother. "Do not you dare try to pin this entirely on me. You knew exactly what the plan was. You signed the physical ledger right next to my name. You authorized the embezzlement 2 years ago to cover your massive gambling debts because the syndicate was threatening to break your legs. You wanted him dead just as much as I did so you could keep your precious country club membership." I sat next to Julian in the dark concrete warehouse watching the glorious implosion of their toxic family dynamic. The moment they were faced with actual consequences, their profound loyalty vanished instantly. They were turning on each other like starving wolves locked in a cage, desperate to save their own skin by offering up the others. "You are a monster," Elias Cecilia screamed back at him, her elegant facade completely shattered. "You were always jealous of your brother. You could never measure up to his success, so you tried to steal his empire and you dragged me into your sick, twisted scheme. I am going to tell the authorities everything. I will testify against you in federal court to prove my innocence." They were screaming over each other, hurling accusations, and exposing every dirty secret they had kept hidden for years. The flight attendants had retreated to the back galley, terrified of the violent breakdown happening in the first-class cabin. Julian watched them tear each other apart, his expression completely unreadable. He had spent his entire life trying to protect these people, providing for them, and carrying the weight of their failures. Now he was finally seeing them for exactly who they were. Victoria suddenly threw herself forward, unbuckling her seatbelt and falling to her knees in the middle of the airplane aisle. She crawled toward the monitor, looking up at Julian's face with an expression of pure, pathetic desperation. She was activating her ultimate defense mechanism, the weaponized tears of a fragile white woman who claimed to be a victim of circumstance. "Julian, please, you have to listen to me." Victoria sobbed, her shoulders shaking as she performed the role of the terrified, helpless wife. "I was so scared. Elias is a monster. He forced me to do all of this. He beat me, Julian. He threatened to kill me if I did not help him transfer the money. I had no idea he was going to poison you. I am just a victim in all of this. He manipulated me because I was vulnerable. Please, you have to believe me. I never wanted any of this to happen." Elias stared at his wife, his mouth hanging open in absolute stunned silence. He was a greedy coward, but Victoria was a master manipulator. She was completely willing to send her husband to federal prison for the rest of his life, if it meant she could walk away clean and maintain her wealthy lifestyle. I leaned into the camera frame, positioning myself right next to Julian. My face appeared on the airplane monitors right beside my husband's. Victoria stopped crying the exact second she saw my face. Her blue eyes narrowed and the fragile victim facade dropped, instantly replaced by a look of pure venomous hatred. "You are a terrible actress, Victoria," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, echoing through the cabin. "You have spent years using your privilege to play the victim whenever you get caught doing something evil. You called the Atlanta police chief 2 hours ago and cried those exact same fake tears to frame me for kidnapping and murder. But your little performance is not going to work this time." I reached forward and typed a quick command into my keyboard. I had spent the last hour running a deep data extraction on the security camera backups I downloaded from Cecilia's burning mansion. I had found the holy grail of evidence buried in the audio files of the dining room surveillance camera. "I hope everyone is listening closely," I announced, tapping the enter key to broadcast the audio file directly into the airplane cabin. "Because I want you to hear exactly how terrified and helpless Victoria really is." The audio recording started playing loudly through the overhead speakers on the jet. The sound quality was incredibly crisp and clear, capturing a conversation that had taken place in Cecilia's mansion just a few days ago, right after they returned from the board dinner where Julian was poisoned. Victoria's voice echoed through the cabin, but she was not crying or acting like a victim. She was screaming in absolute furious rage. "You are completely useless." Elias Victoria's voice hissed through the speakers, dripping with venom and authority. "I told you to empty the entire vial into his scotch. Why is his heart still beating? The doctor said he might wake up if the dose was not lethal enough. If he wakes up and traces the funds, my father will lose the Senate race, and we will both go to federal prison. You are a weak, pathetic coward, Elias. If you cannot finish the job tonight, I will go into that intensive care unit and inject the potassium chloride into his veins myself. I am not losing $2 billion because you do not have the stomach to kill your own brother." The recording ended, leaving a deafening, heavy silence inside the airplane cabin. Victoria was still kneeling in the aisle, staring blankly at the screen. The color had completely drained from her face. Her entire victim narrative had just been publicly annihilated. She could not blame Elias. She could not claim she was manipulated. The audio proved she was the mastermind behind the entire assassination plot, and she was perfectly willing to murder Julian with her own bare hands to secure her stolen wealth. Elias looked down at his wife with an expression of pure, disgusted horror. "You really were going to let me take the fall for everything?" he whispered, stepping away from her as if she were a venomous snake. "I am not taking the fall for anyone!" Victoria suddenly screamed, her composure completely shattering. She scrambled to her feet, her face twisting into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. She glared at the screen, pointing her finger directly at my face. "You think you have won, Jasmine?" she yelled, her voice cracking with fury. "You think some hacked audio file is going to stop me? You are nothing but a common thug from the South Side playing with computers. My father is a United States Senator. My family owns half the judges in the state of Georgia. I will tie this up in court for decades. I will make sure the media paints you as a deranged hacker who falsified digital evidence. You will never see a single dime of that money. She was hyperventilating, pacing back and forth in the narrow airplane aisle. And you cannot touch me right now, she continued, a manic, desperate laugh escaping her throat. We are beginning our descent. The pilot just announced we are landing at Charles de Gaulle Airport in less than 20 minutes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has absolutely no jurisdiction in France. The moment this plane hits the tarmac, I am walking straight into the International Bank branch at the terminal. I am going to scan my thumbprint, and that $2 billion will vanish into a Swiss black hole where your little tracking programs can never find it. She leaned closer to the monitor, her eyes wide and unhinged. You might have survived, Julian, but your empire belongs to me now. Enjoy your pathetic life in the slums with your ghetto wife. We are untouchable the second we touch French soil. Julian and I sat perfectly still in the dark warehouse watching her manic, arrogant display. We did not argue with her. We did not yell back. We simply stared at her with cold, calculating silence. Have a safe landing, Victoria. Julian said, his voice deadly quiet. We will be watching. I reached forward and severed the video connection. The screens inside the airplane cabin went completely black, leaving them alone in the sky with their own escalating panic and paranoia. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, staring at the live flight tracking map on my secondary monitor. The tiny airplane icon was crossing the border of France, preparing for its final descent into Paris. Victoria truly believed she had won. She believed her white privilege and her father's political power made her a god who could outrun any consequence. She believed that stepping off that plane in a foreign country would magically protect her from the massive federal trap closing in around her. She had no idea that her father was already sitting in an interrogation room in handcuffs. She had no idea that the $2 billion she thought she controlled was currently infected with a digital parasite that was about to trigger an international crisis. Let her land, Julian whispered, standing behind me and watching the flight map trace its final path toward the airport. Let her think she is walking into a bank vault. I folded my arms across my chest, a cold, satisfied smile playing on my lips. She thinks the federal authorities have no jurisdiction in France, I said quietly. She is going to be very surprised to find out who is waiting for her at the gate. The tiny airplane icon on my secondary monitor finally reached the edge of the European continent. I sat in the heavy leather chair inside the dark concrete warehouse, watching the altitude numbers drop rapidly as the private jet began its final descent into Paris. Julian stood behind me, his hands resting firmly on my shoulders. His breathing was steady and calm, a stark contrast to the chaotic panic I knew was currently unfolding inside that luxurious cabin. I brought the internal security camera feedback onto my primary screen. I wanted to see exactly how Victoria, Elias, and Cecilia were handling the last 10 minutes of their flight. The atmosphere inside the first-class cabin was absolutely suffocating. The earlier arrogance and champagne-fueled celebrations were completely gone. Victoria was pacing frantically in the narrow aisle, her designer heels stomping aggressively against the plush carpet. She was chewing nervously on her manicured thumbnail, her face pale and covered in a thin sheen of cold sweat. She kept glancing out the small airplane window as if she expected federal agents to suddenly appear in the clouds. Elias was sitting rigidly in his leather seat, bouncing his knee up and down in a rapid, anxious rhythm. He looked completely shattered. The realization that his brother was still alive, and that his entire murderous plot had been broadcast back to him, had broken whatever small amount of courage he possessed. He kept running his trembling hands through his hair, muttering quietly to himself. Cecilia was slouched in the corner suite, her face buried in her hands, rocking back and forth. The powerful, untouchable matriarch of the Atlanta elite had been reduced to a terrified, shivering mess. "Listen to me." Victoria snapped, her voice sharp and authoritative, echoing through the hidden microphones. "Stop crying, Cecilia. You are making me sick. We are landing in exactly 5 minutes. The moment those cabin doors open, we do not stop for anything. We do not speak to customs. We do not wait for our checked luggage. We take our carry-on bags and we walk straight to the private international banking lounge located right inside the terminal." Elias looked up, his eyes wide and panicked. "Victoria, they know everything," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Julian is alive. Jasmine has the ledger. They probably sent the evidence to the federal authorities already." We cannot just walk through the airport like nothing happened. They are going to arrest us. Victoria marched over and grabbed Elias by the collar of his expensive custom-tailored shirt, pulling him forcefully upward. "Are you really this stupid, Elias?" She hissed, her face inches from his. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation has absolutely zero jurisdiction on French soil. We are in Europe now. They cannot just magically send agents across the world to arrest an American politician's daughter without a massive mountain of international red tape. It takes weeks to process an international extradition warrant." She shoved him back into his seat, smoothing out the wrinkles in her own expensive silk blouse. "We have a massive head start," she continued, her voice dripping with desperate, arrogant logic. "I set up the Swiss holding accounts perfectly. The $2 billion is sitting right there waiting for my biometric signature to clear the final holding phase. The second I put my thumb on that glass scanner inside the terminal, the money drops into 12 different decentralized anonymous accounts. We take the money, we hire the best defense lawyers in Europe, and we disappear to a country with no extradition treaty. We have won, Elias. Jasmine is just trying to scare us because she knows she cannot actually touch the money." I watched her perform this desperate mental gymnastics, and I actually had to smile. Her absolute blind faith in her own privilege was staggering. She truly believed that because she was wealthy and white, the international borders would magically shield her from the consequences of attempted murder and massive federal fraud. She had absolutely no idea that I had not blocked the money from traveling. She had no idea that her precious $2 billion was currently acting as a digital homing beacon for the highest levels of global law enforcement. The private jet touched down on the tarmac at Charles de Gaulle Airport with a heavy thud. The camera feed shook slightly as the massive aircraft engaged its thrusters to slow down. I tapped a few keys on my board, pulling up a secondary feed from the airport's own internal security network. I had breached their public-facing firewall an hour ago just so I could track their movements once they left the airplane. The jet taxied quickly toward the private VIP gate designated for high-net-worth international travelers. Before the seatbelt sign even turned off, Victoria was already pulling her heavy designer bags from the overhead compartments. She shoved a smaller leather bag into Elias's chest, forcing him to stand up. "Move," she ordered, kicking Cecilia's leg to force the older woman out of her seat. "We do not have time to wait for the flight attendants." The heavy cabin door hissed open and the automatic stairs deployed. Victoria did not even wait for the pilots to give the all-clear. She grabbed her bags and practically sprinted down the metal stairs. She aggressively shoved a flight attendant out of her way, causing the young woman to stumble backward against the bulkhead. Elias and Cecilia hurried after her, their heads down, trying to hide their faces from anyone watching. I switched my monitors to the airport terminal cameras, watching them enter the lavishly decorated private arrival lounge. It was a beautiful space filled with marble floors and expensive modern art designed specifically to make billionaires feel comfortable while they bypassed the normal chaotic customs lines. Victoria marched with purpose, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished stone floor. She led Elias and Cecilia past the luxury seating areas and headed straight for the secure digital banking kiosks located in the far corner of the lounge. These kiosks were directly linked to the Central European banking grid, allowing ultra-wealthy clients to manage their offshore accounts the second they landed on the continent. "This is it," Victoria said, her voice echoing faintly through the airport security microphones I had tapped into. "I am transferring the funds right now." The moment the screen flashes green, we walk out to the private car service and we drive straight to the border. Julian leaned closer to the monitor, his chest pressing firmly against the back of my leather chair. "This is the exact moment," he whispered, his voice low and intense. "She is about to trigger the parasite code." I opened my proprietary tracking software on the center screen. A massive digital map of the global financial network appeared, glowing with bright blue routing lines representing the $2 billion sitting in the temporary European holding accounts. I watched as Victoria's secure banking application established a connection with the terminal. On the security camera feed, I saw Victoria place her thumb firmly onto the glowing biometric scanner attached to the kiosk. The machine beeped, verifying her unique biological signature. She typed her complex alphanumeric password into the touchscreen, her fingers moving with frantic, desperate speed. Elias and Cecilia stood right behind her, holding their breath. Their entire future, their freedom, and their lives depended entirely on that single digital transaction. They watched the screen with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for the confirmation that they were officially billionaires. On my computer screen, the parasite code detected her verified biometric signature. The trap I had laid hours ago was finally sprung. I did not just block the money, I ripped it entirely out of her hands. The parasite code activated instantly, overriding the strict privacy protocols of the Swiss banking system. It triggered an immediate catastrophic reversal of the entire $2 billion transfer. I watched the bright blue lines on my digital map suddenly snap backward, violently, redirecting the massive fortune away from the anonymous offshore accounts and sending every single cent straight back to Julian's highly secured primary investment fund in Atlanta. But the parasite code did not stop there. The exact millisecond the money bounced back, my software executed its secondary directive. It automatically packaged the entire digital history of the transaction, along with the high-resolution photographs of the physical ledger I had stolen from Cecilia's safe. It bundled the audio recordings of Victoria planning the murder, and it blasted the entire unredacted evidence file directly to the central command servers of Interpol in Lyon, France. I sat back in my chair, letting out a long, slow breath. The money was safe. The evidence was delivered. The digital snare was pulled completely tight. I turned my full attention back to the airport security camera feed to watch the physical fallout of my digital warfare. Victoria was staring at the banking kiosk screen. She tapped the glass surface once, then twice. Her frantic tapping quickly turned into aggressive, violent pounding. The screen was reflecting a pale blue light across her horrified face. "What is wrong?" Elias asked, stepping closer and trying to look over her shoulder. "Why is it taking so long? Did the transfer clear?" Victoria did not answer him. She could not answer him. Her mouth was open, but her vocal cords seemed completely paralyzed. Her hands were shaking so violently, she dropped her expensive leather purse onto the marble floor. I used my backdoor access to the banking terminal to mirror exactly what Victoria was seeing on her screen. I pushed the image to my secondary monitor so Julian could see it too. The banking application displayed her primary offshore account details. The total available balance was printed in large, bold numbers right in the center of the screen. $0.00. Right beneath the empty balance, the account holder name had been completely wiped out. My parasite code had rewritten the administrative data field, leaving a customized message permanently burned into her banking profile for her to read. The text on the screen read simply, "Hello from the South Side." Victoria let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a guttural, agonizing shriek of pure, absolute devastation. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire privileged, untouchable life shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "No," she screamed, slamming her fists against the reinforced glass of the banking kiosk. "No, this is impossible. The money was right here. I saw the routing numbers. The money was right here." Elias shoved her aside and stared at the screen himself. He read the zero balance and the customized message I had left for them. His knees physically buckled under his weight. He staggered backward, crashing hard against a marble pillar and sliding slowly down to the floor. "She took it back," Elias whispered, his voice completely hollow and devoid of any hope. "Jasmine took it all back. She hacked the European grid. We have absolutely nothing left." Cecilia let out a pathetic, wailing cry, clutching her chest as she looked between her son and her daughter-in-law. "What do you mean we have nothing left?" she sobbed frantically, grabbing Elias by the shoulders and shaking him. "We need that money to pay the lawyers. We need that money to disappear." "Where is the money, Elias?" "It is gone, Mother," Elias shouted back, tears of pure panic streaming down his face. "Jasmine outsmarted us. She played us from the very beginning. We are stranded in a foreign country with no money, no security, and no way home. We are completely broke." Victoria pulled her cell phone from her pocket, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the device. "I am calling my father," she gasped, scrolling wildly through her contacts. "He will wire us emergency funds. He will send a private security contractor to get us out of the airport. He can fix this." I watched her dial the number, pressing the phone tightly to her ear. I knew exactly what she was going to hear. Her father's personal cell phone was currently sitting in an evidence bag on a metal table inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Atlanta. He was not going to answer. He was never going to answer her calls ever again. Victoria pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. It went straight to voicemail, she whispered, her voice cracking. He always answers his private line. Why is he not answering? Because he is wearing federal handcuffs right now, Victoria Julian said out loud, even though she could not hear him through the muted camera feed. His voice was calm and filled with absolute undeniable justice. They were completely stranded inside the private terminal. They had no access to their stolen billions. They had no powerful political allies left to bail them out. Their entire empire of arrogance and cruelty had been completely systematically dismantled by a woman they thought they could easily crush. Victoria, Elias, and Cecilia stood in the center of the luxurious lounge looking like terrified, trapped animals. They grabbed their bags and began rushing frantically toward the exit doors leading out into the main concourse of the airport. They still believed that if they could just get out of the building, they could somehow disappear into the crowded streets of Paris and hide. They thought the nightmare was over just because they had lost the money. I smiled coldly, watching them sprint toward the heavy glass doors. They had absolutely no idea that losing the money was only the first part of their punishment. The digital trap I set had already alerted the authorities, and the real nightmare was waiting for them right outside the terminal gates. Watch this, Julian, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms over my chest. This is the part where they finally realize that privilege cannot save you from the consequences of your own evil. Let them open those doors. Let them see exactly what happens when you try to murder a man and steal his legacy. We sat together in the dark concrete warehouse, our eyes fixed on the glowing monitor, waiting for the final absolute masterpiece of justice to unfold. Everything they had done to us, the poison, the lies, the weaponized tears, and the blatant racism, was about to be returned to them 1,000 times over. All they had to do was push those heavy glass doors open. And they did. They pushed the doors open and walked straight into their own ultimate destruction. Minimum effort, maximum penalty. The trap was sprung, and the hunters were about to become the prey. The long game was finally over, and we had won. Everything was exactly as it should be. The final act was ready to begin. The final curtain was ready to fall. I just had to sit back and watch the show. Through the high-definition security cameras mounted outside the private aviation terminal, I watched the heavy glass doors slide open. Victoria marched out first, leading the way with her chin held high and her shoulders pulled back. She still possessed the desperate, arrogant belief that she was entirely in control of her destiny. She expected to see a line of sleek black luxury town cars waiting on the pristine tarmac to whisk her away to a five-star hotel in the center of Paris. She expected obsequious chauffeurs ready to carry her expensive designer bags. She expected the world to roll out a red carpet for her simply because she demanded it. Instead, she stepped out into a blinding wall of flashing blue and red emergency lights. The private loading zone was completely surrounded. Dozens of heavily armored black utility vehicles were parked in a tight, impenetrable semicircle blocking every single exit route. Elite tactical officers wearing dark body armor with the word police printed across their chests in bright white letters stood shoulder to shoulder. They had their submachine guns raised and aimed directly at the terminal doors. Standing right in front of the tactical team were several plainclothes detectives wearing distinctive armbands that identified them as agents of the international criminal police organization known as Interpol. Victoria froze completely dead in her tracks. Her expensive designer heels scraped loudly against the concrete as she abruptly stopped walking. Elias and Cecilia bumped into her from behind, entirely unprepared for the massive blockade standing between them and their freedom. I leaned forward in my heavy leather chair, watching the stunning realization slowly wash over Victoria's pale face. She looked left and then she looked right, her blue eyes darting frantically across the sea of heavily armed federal police officers. She was searching for a gap in the perimeter, searching for a loophole, searching for a manager she could complain to. But there were no loopholes left. The entire might of the European law enforcement apparatus was staring down the barrel of their rifles straight at her chest. A tall, stern-looking French police captain stepped forward from the line of armored officers. He held up his hand, signaling for them to stop exactly where they were. He spoke into a small tactical radio attached to his shoulder before turning his attention entirely to Victoria. He instructed her in clear, heavily accented English to drop all her bags and place her hands on top of her head. He announced that she was under arrest for massive international money laundering, federal wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. I watched the color completely drain from Cecilia's face. The older woman stumbled backward, clutching her chest, as if she had just been physically struck. She looked at the dozens of guns pointed at her family and finally realized that her elite country club status meant absolutely nothing in the face of an international criminal tribunal. She was not a respected matriarch of Atlanta society anymore. She was just an accomplice to a brutal assassination plot. Elias immediately dropped his leather travel bag, letting it hit the concrete with a dull thud. He raised his trembling hands high above his head, his face twisted in a mask of absolute pathetic cowardice. He was completely ready to surrender, hoping he could somehow strike a plea deal by throwing his own wife under the bus. He had no loyalty to anyone but himself. But Victoria refused to surrender. She refused to accept that she had been completely, utterly defeated by a woman she considered to be beneath her. Her shock rapidly transformed into a violent, arrogant rage. She clutched her designer purse tightly against her chest and took an aggressive step forward, pointing her finger directly at the French police captain. "Do not you dare touch me!" Victoria screamed, her voice shrill and echoing loudly across the empty tarmac through the security microphones. "You have absolutely no idea who I am. You cannot arrest me. I am an American citizen. My father is a highly respected United States Senator. He has powerful friends in the State Department. If you lay a single finger on me, he will have your badge and he will cause an international diplomatic crisis." The French captain did not even blink. He gestured to two female tactical officers who immediately moved forward, grabbing Victoria's arms and forcefully twisting them behind her back. Victoria began thrashing and kicking wildly, her expensive silk blouse tearing at the shoulder as she fought against the armed officers. She was completely losing her mind, screaming at the top of her lungs. "This is a setup!" Victoria shrieked, her face turning a violent shade of crimson. "This is a massive illegal setup orchestrated by a ghetto black woman from the slums of Atlanta. She hacked your systems. She planted false evidence. You are arresting the wrong person. I am the victim here. Let me go right now, or I will sue this entire airport into the ground." I sat next to Julian in the dark warehouse, listening to her scream those vile racist insults. She was still trying to weaponize her white privilege, using her skin color and her father's political title as a shield against her own evil actions. She still believed the authorities would naturally side with her. The French captain watched her struggle with an expression of absolute cold professional indifference. He stepped closer to her, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are making a terrible mistake!" Victoria sobbed loudly, trying one last time to use her manipulative tears to sway the officers. "My father is going to destroy your career. Call him right now. Call my father in Atlanta, and he will clear this entire thing up." The captain calmly secured the heavy steel cuffs around her wrists, locking them tight with a sharp metallic click. He looked her directly in the eyes, his expression completely devoid of any pity. "We cannot call your father, mademoiselle," the captain replied, his thick accent delivering the absolute ultimate crushing blow. "Your father was arrested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for massive campaign finance fraud and receiving illicit offshore funds an hour ago. His assets are completely frozen, and he is currently sitting in a federal holding cell in America. You have absolutely no one left to call." The profound, absolute silence that followed his words was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Victoria stopped screaming. She stopped fighting. Her entire body went completely limp in the arms of the tactical officers. The arrogant, untouchable political princess finally realized that her absolute ultimate shield had been completely shattered. Her father could not save her. Her money was gone. Her privilege had been entirely neutralized by a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence. She collapsed to her knees on the cold, hard concrete of the French airport tarmac, her head hanging down in total, utter defeat. The realization that she was going to spend the next 20 years of her life in a tiny concrete cell finally broke her completely. I looked over at Julian. He was watching the monitor with a look of profound closure. The woman who had poisoned him and mocked his wife was finally facing the exact justice she deserved. Elias was quickly tackled to the ground by 3 armed officers and securely handcuffed. He was crying like a terrified child, begging the officers to believe that Victoria had forced him to do everything. He was still trying to save himself, but nobody was listening to his pathetic lies anymore. Cecilia had completely fallen apart. The elite matriarch was on her knees weeping hysterically as 2 female officers gently but firmly pulled her arms behind her back. She was looking wildly around the tarmac, her makeup smeared and ruined running in dark black streams down her face. In her desperate panic, Cecilia noticed one of the Interpol detectives holding a secure digital tablet. The detective had been using it to verify their identities, matching their faces with the digital warrants I had triggered through the parasite code. The tablet screen was still actively connected to my secure network feed. Cecilia broke away from the arresting officers just long enough to throw herself toward the detective. She dropped to her knees in front of the glowing tablet screen, her eyes locking directly onto Julian's face, broadcasting live from our dark warehouse in Atlanta. "Julian," she wailed, her voice cracking with sheer absolute desperation. "Julian, my beautiful boy, please help me. Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them I had nothing to do with this. I am your mother, Julian. I gave you life. You cannot let them take me away to prison. I will die in there. Please, Julian, have mercy on your own mother." Her loud, pathetic sobs echoed through the warehouse speakers. She was begging the son she had happily abandoned on a hospital bed just 9 hours ago. She was asking for mercy from the man she had allowed to be poisoned, all so she could pay off her underground gambling debts and keep her expensive country club membership. Julian sat perfectly still in front of the camera. He looked at the woman who had brought him into the world, the woman who had ultimately chosen her own greed over his life. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a deep, profound sadness and an absolute unwavering resolution. "You stopped being my mother the moment you chose that money over my life," Julian said, his voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. "You made your choice, Cecilia. Now you have to live with the consequences of it." "Julian, no," she screamed, thrashing wildly, as the French police officers finally pulled her away from the tablet screen and dragged her toward the waiting transport vehicles. "You cannot do this to me, Julian. I am your mother." Julian reached forward and gently pressed the key to terminate the audio and video connection. The screen went completely black, cutting off her frantic screaming screams forever. We sat in the heavy silence of the underground warehouse. The chaotic sounds of the arrest, the sirens, the shouting, and the desperate pleas for mercy were all completely gone. There was nothing left but the quiet, steady hum of the massive server rack's cooling fans. I turned my head and looked at Julian. The immense, heavy burden he had been carrying for years, the toxic, crushing weight of his manipulative, greedy family, had finally been completely lifted from his shoulders. He looked exhausted, but he also looked incredibly peaceful. "It is over," I said softly, reaching out to take his hand. My fingers intertwined with his, feeling the strong, steady pulse of his heart beating through his skin. "We actually did it, Julian. We stopped them." He squeezed my hand, pulling me close to him. He rested his forehead against mine, taking a long, deep breath of the cool air in the server room. "No," he whispered, his dark eyes finding mine in the dim light of the monitors. "You did it, Jasmine. You saved my life. You fought an entire army for me when everyone else left me to die. You burned their corrupt world to the ground and you gave me my future back." I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "They thought they could step on us because they had money and power," I said, my voice filled with a quiet, fierce pride. "They forgot that power is just data, and I know exactly how to rewrite the code." The nightmare was finally over. The poison, the betrayal, the lies, and the arrogant racism had all been completely neutralized. We were alive, and we were entirely free. We had survived the absolute worst they could throw at us, and we had emerged stronger than we had ever been before. I looked back at the blank monitors, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. The girl from the South Side had not just survived the elite predators, she had completely rewritten the rules of their game and won. I closed the laptop, shutting down the terminal. It was time to go home. It was time to start our new life. We walked out of the underground warehouse together as the first rays of morning sun began to break over the Atlanta skyline. The cool dawn air felt incredibly clean, filling my lungs with a profound sense of absolute renewal. I supported Julian's weight as we moved toward my analog car, but his steps were growing steadily stronger with every passing minute. The antidote had fully restored his physical strength, but it was the undeniable taste of justice that had truly brought him back to life. We did not go back to our house. We drove straight to the primary headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in downtown Atlanta. I parked the battered car right in front of the massive glass building. We walked through the front doors carrying the heavy leather-bound ledger and the encrypted digital drives containing the parasite code data. The federal agents were already expecting us. Victoria's father was currently sitting in one of their interrogation rooms, and the sudden massive international arrest at the Paris airport had triggered a global alert across their entire network. We sat in a secure conference room for 6 hours, presenting our irrefutable evidence to the lead federal prosecutors. I walked them through every single line of the physical ledger, matching the handwritten notes to the digital transaction receipts I had intercepted. I played the audio recording of Victoria demanding my husband's murder. I showed them the exact security logs proving Elias had remotely locked the mansion doors and triggered the incendiary devices to burn me alive. The evidence was absolutely flawless and completely undeniable. By noon, the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially cleared both Julian and me of all fabricated charges. The local police chief who had blindly followed Victoria's tearful phone call was immediately suspended and placed under federal investigation for deep political corruption. The massive manhunt that had been hunting me through the streets of my own city was officially called off. We were entirely free. The international extradition process took exactly 3 weeks. The French authorities happily handed Elias and Victoria over to the American federal marshals. I watched the local news broadcast as they were dragged off a government transport plane in heavy steel chains. The arrogant, untouchable heirs of the political elite were stripped of their designer clothes and forced into bright orange prison jumpsuits. The federal trial was a massive media spectacle, but it did not last very long. Victoria attempted to use her weaponized tears one final time, standing in front of the federal judge and begging for mercy. She claimed she was just a vulnerable woman who had been manipulated by her husband. But the judge had already listened to the audio recordings. He saw right through her pathetic manipulative performance. He sentenced both Victoria and Elias to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. They would spend the next 2 decades sitting in tiny concrete boxes, completely stripped of their wealth and their white privilege. Cecilia's downfall was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. The federal government seized absolutely every single asset connected to her name. The ruins of her burned-down mansion were foreclosed upon to pay back the massive debts she had hidden for years. Her offshore accounts were drained to zero. The elite country club society she had worshipped her entire life completely turned their backs on her. They erased her name from their charity boards and refused to take her desperate phone calls. With no money and no family left to exploit, Cecilia was forced to move into a rundown state-funded nursing home on the very edge of the city. She spent her days sitting in a small, sterile room surrounded by people who did not care about her past status or her designer shoes. The woman who had thrown medical bills at me and told me to unplug my husband was now entirely dependent on the meager charity of the state. She was completely, utterly alone. 1 year later, I stood on the massive glass balcony of the tallest corporate skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. The morning sun was reflecting brightly off the surrounding buildings, casting a warm golden glow across the busy city streets below. I took a deep breath, feeling the gentle wind brush against my face. I was no longer just the owner of a small independent cybersecurity firm. Following the massive federal trial, the board of directors for Julian's investment fund had unanimously voted to completely restructure their entire corporate leadership team. They needed someone with absolute financial integrity and unmatched forensic accounting skills to rebuild their shattered reputation. They asked me to take the helm. I was now the official chairwoman of the entire $2 billion corporate empire. I had merged my security firm with their financial divisions, creating the most transparent and heavily fortified investment portfolio in the country. The girl from the South Side was now running the most powerful boardroom in the state. I heard the soft click of the balcony doors opening behind me. Julian walked out into the sunlight holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He wore a perfectly tailored dark blue suit, his posture straight and confident. The physical scars from the poison and the hospital were completely gone, replaced by a vibrant, healthy energy that radiated from him. He walked over and handed me a cup of coffee, wrapping his free arms securely around my waist. He pulled me close, resting his chin gently on the top of my head, as we looked out over the sprawling city together. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, Madam Chairwoman," he whispered, his voice warm and filled with profound, absolute pride. "They are ready to review your new expansion protocols." I leaned back against his strong chest, smiling as I took a sip of the warm coffee. "It feels good to finally be the one writing the rules," I said quietly. Julian turned me around so I was facing him. He looked down into my eyes with an expression of pure, absolute devotion. "You saved my life, Jasmine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my legacy, and you saved my soul. I am honored to stand right beside you as your equal partner." I reached up and gently touched his face, feeling the solid, steady warmth of his skin. "We saved each other, Julian," I replied softly. I turned back to look at the massive, beautiful city spread out before us. The elite predators who had tried to destroy us were locked away in cages or rotting in lonely, forgotten rooms. They had vastly underestimated the strength of a woman who had built her entire life from scratch. They thought my background made me weak. They thought their money made them invincible. They had learned the hard way that you can leave a man for dead in a sterile hospital room, but you can never outsmart a woman who knows how to truly own her power. I had taken their greatest weapons and turned them into ashes, and I had built my own beautiful empire right on top of their ruins. The greatest lesson I learned from this terrifying ordeal is that true power does not come from generational wealth, social status, or unearned privilege. My in-laws believed that their money and political connections made them completely untouchable. They underestimated me because of where I grew up, assuming that a woman from the South Side would just quietly accept defeat. But resilience and intellect will always outlast corrupt arrogance. You can strip away a person's resources, but you can never take away their ability to fight back if they know how to own their truth and leverage their own strength. If you have ever had to fight back against toxic people who underestimated your worth, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own survival story in the comments below.